A stranger reminds us. The world is gentler than we've allowed ourselves to believe. They don't do anything extraordinary. They don't change our lives overnight. They simply cross our path at exactly the moment we need a little kindness. Sometimes that's enough to carry us through the rest of the day. We hear so many stories about what's broken in the world. It's easy to believe kindness has become rare. But I don't think that's true. I think most kindness happens quietly. It doesn't make the evening news. No one applauds it. Most of the time, it's forgotten by the person who offered it, but never by the person who received it. A woman named Margaret shared this story with me one winter afternoon. She had just turned 71, soft-spoken, the kind of person who still wrote birthday cards by hand, who thanked cashiers by name, who always carried tissues in her purse because, as she once told me, you never know who might need one. She lived alone now. A small white house on a quiet street. The same house she'd shared with her husband for more than 40 years. When she talked about him, she didn't use the past tense very often, not because she forgot. Some loves simply refused to become memories. The morning she remembered most began before sunrise. A thin layer of snow covered the front steps. The neighborhood was almost silent. Margaret stood by the front door, wearing a blue knit beanie. It wasn't an expensive hat. The yarn had started to loosen around one side. One tiny thread refused to stay tucked in. She reached up, smoothed it with her fingers, and smiled. My husband always said, I looked younger in this hat. She laughed softly after saying that. The funny thing is, I still wore it every winter. She picked up her purse, stopped, looked around the house, not because she'd forgotten something, because leaving had become unfamiliar. The living room looked exactly as it always had. His favorite chair still faced the window. A crossword puzzle rested on the little table beside it, half finished, just the way he'd left it months before. Margaret stood there for another moment, then quietly whispered, All right, I think I'm ready. She wasn't talking to herself. A taxi pulled up a few minutes later. The driver stepped out before she had reached the front gate. He couldn't have been much younger than 50. A heavy winter jacket, gray beginning to show at his temples. He smiled. Good morning. Take your time. 3 simple words, spoken so naturally, they almost disappeared into the cold morning air. Margaret smiled politely. Thank you. She walked slowly toward the car. Not because of her age, because every step away from the house felt heavier than the one before. The driver noticed. He didn't hurry her. He simply opened the rear door, waited, and when she was finally seated comfortably, he gently closed it. Nothing more, just a small kindness. The kind that most people would forget before lunch day. Margaret didn't. As the taxi pulled away, the neighborhood drifted quietly past the window. Children in oversized winter coats waited for the school bus. A man shoveled snow from his driveway. Someone was walking a golden retriever that seemed far more interested in the snow than the morning. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary. Margaret rested one hand on her purse, the other on the blue knit hat in her lap. She looked out the window without saying a word. The driver glanced once in the rear-view mirror, then looked back at the road. He didn't ask where she was headed. The navigation already knew. He didn't try to make conversation. Some passengers wanted to talk. Others needed silence. After 23 years behind the wheel, he had learned there was a difference. About 10 minutes into the ride, they stopped at a red light. The driver looked into the mirror. You warm enough back there? Margaret looked up. I am. He nodded. Good. The light turned green. The taxi rolled forward again. For another few minutes, All they heard was the quiet hum of the engine and the windshield wipers brushing away the falling snow. Then Margaret spoke, more to herself than to him. I haven't been there in quite a while. The driver didn't ask where there was. He simply nodded. I understand. And somehow, those two words made the car feel just a little less quiet. The farther they drove, the quieter the city became. Morning traffic slowly faded behind them. Neighborhood stores gave way to older streets lined with bare maple trees. Margaret kept watching the window, not really looking at anything, just watching the world move past. Every now and then, she reached up and adjusted the blue knit beanie, almost absent-mindedly, as though touching it somehow made the ride a little easier. Sam noticed, not the sadness, just the habit. Years behind the wheel had taught him something. People always carry something with them. A photograph tucked inside a wallet, flowers resting on the seat beside them, an old wedding ring they keep turning with their thumb, or a worn-out winter hat they touch every few minutes without realizing it. He never asked about those things. If people wanted to tell their story, they would. If they didn't, that was all right too. They stopped behind a school bus. Children climbed aboard one by one. A little girl dropped her mitten. Before she could bend down to pick it up, another child handed it back to her. Sam smiled. Kids are pretty good at looking out for each other. Margaret followed his eyes. She smiled too. They are. It wasn't much of a conversation, but it didn't need to be. Some conversations don't begin with questions. They begin with two people quietly noticing the same thing. A few minutes later, Sam spoke again. Would you mind if I rolled the heat up a little? Margaret shook her head. Not at all. The mornings seem colder every year. She laughed softly. Or maybe we're just getting older. Sam chuckled. I've been blaming the weather. Maybe I should start blaming my knees instead. Margaret laughed. Just for a second. A small laugh. The first one she'd heard from herself, and longer than she could remember. The taxi continued north. Snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield. The radio played low enough that neither of them paid much attention to it. A familiar song came on. An old one. The kind people don't realize they still know until they hear the first few notes. Margaret looked toward the dashboard. My husband loved this song. The words came out so naturally. It took her a moment to realize she'd said them aloud. Sam didn't turn around. He didn't say he was sorry. He didn't search for comforting words. He simply reached over and turned the music up. Just enough for the song to fill the silence. Margaret looked out the window again. She smiled, very gently, then closed her eyes for a moment. When the song ended, Sam turned the volume back down. Neither of them mentioned it. Some kindness doesn't need to explain itself, yet. About 20 minutes into the drive, the navigation spoke. Your destination is ahead. The road became narrower. Tall evergreens lined both sides. The city seemed very far away now. Margaret looked through the windshield, then quietly said, Could we stop here for just a minute? Of course. Sam eased the taxi to the curb, shifted into park, turned off the meter. He didn't announce it. He simply reached forward and pressed one button. The numbers disappeared from the screen. Caught. Margaret noticed. You didn't have to do that. Sam shrugged. No rush. 3 simple words, the same ones he'd spoken that morning. This time, they meant something different. Margaret looked down at her hands, still resting on the blue knit beanie. Then she whispered, almost too softly to hear. He always hated when people felt rushed. Sam nodded. I can understand that. It was all he said. Because sometimes understanding doesn't need to sound bigger than it is. She sighed. Margaret opened the car door. The cold winter air rushed inside. She stepped out slowly. Not because she was afraid of slipping, because she finally saw where she had come. Rows of quiet white headstones stretched across the hill. Snow rested gently on each one. She stood beside the taxi. For a long moment, the blue knit beanie pulled low against the wind. Sam remained in the driver's seat, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, looking straight ahead, giving her exactly what she needed: privacy, without making her feel alone. Margaret stood there for a long time. The winter air was quiet. Snow continued falling, softly enough that it barely made a sound. She adjusted the blue knit beanie one more time, then slowly walked toward a small headstone near the old maple tree. Sam never looked, not because he wasn't curious, because he believed everyone deserved a little privacy with the people they loved. He simply sat behind the wheel, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, watching snow collect along the edge of the windshield. Nearly 20 minutes passed, maybe longer. Sam never checked the time. He never restarted the meter. He simply waited, the same way he always had. Years earlier, an older driver had told him something during his first week on the job. You'll never really know what someone is carrying when they get into your cup. So don't be the reason they have to carry a little more. Sam had never forgotten those words, not because they sounded wise, because they sounded true. That's why. Eventually, Margaret began walking back. Her steps were still slow, but somehow they seemed lighter. When she reached the taxi, Sam stepped out before she had the chance to open the door. He held it for her, just as he had that morning. Margaret smiled. "Thank you." He smiled back. "My pleasure." Nothing more. The drive home felt different. Not happier, just quieter in a different way. The kind of quiet that follows after you've finally said something your heart had been holding for a long time. Neither of them spoke much. Neither felt they needed to. As they turned onto Margaret Street, she looked out at the familiar houses to eyes. Children had started building snowmen in front yards. Someone was hanging a wreath on a front door. Life had quietly continued while she was away, for the first time in months. That no longer hurt. When the taxi stopped in front of her house, Margaret reached into her purse. Sam shook his head gently. "I've already taken care of the waiting time." Margaret looked surprised. "You were waiting for me." Sam smiled. "I was." She hesitated. "You didn't have to." He shrugged. It just didn't feel right to charge someone for taking their time. Margaret looked down for a moment, then back at him. "You've been very kind today." Sam smiled the way people do when they aren't quite sure what to do with a compliment. "I hope you have a peaceful afternoon." He closed the door gently, waved once, then drove away. Within seconds, the yellow taxi disappeared around the corner. Margaret stood on the front porch, watching until the street became quiet again. She reached up, touched the blue knit beanie, then looked toward the empty chair beside the living room window. For the first time, she walked inside without feeling like the house was asking her to be sad. She hung the beanie on the same hook by the front door. Not because winter was over, because somehow today felt different. That evening, her granddaughter called. They talked longer than usual. Before hanging up, Margaret said something she hadn't planned to say. "Would you like to come over next weekend?" There was a short pause. "I'd love that, Grandma." After the call ended, Margaret smiled. She didn't realize it, but one quiet act of kindness that morning had already begun reaching someone else. A few days later, a young driver named Carlos was finishing his first month with the taxi company. It had been a difficult week. Too many long hours. Too many impatient passengers. He was beginning to wonder if he'd chosen the wrong job. During a break, he walked into the dispatch office to grab a cup of coffee. Someone had pinned a printed customer comment to the bulletin board. No one's name, no company announcement, just a short note. He read it almost without thinking. Thank you to the driver who reminded me that kindness still exists. You probably thought you were just doing your job. You weren't. You helped make a difficult day a little easier. Carlos stood there for a moment, then folded the paper back exactly the way he'd found it. Later that afternoon, an elderly man struggled to lift a heavy grocery bag into Carlos's trunk. Carlos got out of the car, picked it up without saying a word. The man smiled. Thank you. Carlos smiled back. My pleasure. Then he closed the trunk and drove away. The older I get, the more I believe kindness rarely travels in straight lines. Someone is patient with us. Years later, without even realizing it, we become patient with someone else. A stranger holds the door. One day, we find ourselves doing the same. Maybe that's how the world becomes a little gentler. Not through grand gestures, but through ordinary people, quietly passing small kindnesses from one life to another. If today's story reminded you of someone, I hope you carry that kindness with you. You'd never know whose day might become lighter because of it. Thank you for spending this time with me. I'll see you again next time.